What is important is that Prime Minister Modi is talking to both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. My sense is that even after his visit to the Ukraine, he will keep in touch with both the presidents. He will see whether there are any broad aspects of their messages that can be, let's say, mutually conveyed. And he will certainly see whether there is any scope that either side is expressing that can bring them closer together. So I think conveying of messages.
Very much like mediation suddenly.
No, mediation is when you sit the two sides together and you start negotiating on what could be a compromise. Mediation is a more involved process. What we are doing is creating goodwill that enables us to remain in touch with both sides and creating the broad basis of confidence building that, as I said, would bring them to the negotiating table. And that's when the mediation starts, because that is when you come down to the brass tacks. We are not talking about
what Egypt and Qatar and perhaps even the United States are attempting between Hamas and Israel. They don't have the two on the same negotiating table, but they're carrying messages backwards and forwards and trying to bring some agreement between the two positions. You're suggesting Mr. Modi will try something very similar between Ukraine and Russia.
The difference, I think, is very clear, is that we are talking about a very broad approach towards restoration of peace and stability. Whereas in the Middle East and what you're talking about, it is more a question of getting all the sides together and trying to hammer out a process. I think the Israelis have also been involved in the peace talks in person. It's not just remotely, but certainly mediation can be both remote and in person. I'm not denying that factor.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Later today, Friday the 23rd, Prime Minister Modi will arrive in Kyiv for an 8-hour visit to the Ukraine. What's prompted this visit? Is it happening under pressure from the West? What can it achieve? And what impact will it have on India's relationship both with Russia and the United States of America? Joining me to help answer these questions is India's former Foreign Secretary, Vardhan Shringla. Mr. Shringla, later today, Friday the 23rd, in fact, I would add within half an hour of our recording, the Prime Minister is scheduled to arrive in Ukraine for an 8-hour visit. How do you view this trip? In the present circumstances, do you see it as a wise and thoughtful step or a somewhat inconsidered and mistaken one?
Prime Minister Modi, in his, he had some extensive interactions in Poland with his counterpart, Prime Minister Donald Tusk. And Poland, in many ways, is a sort of gateway to Ukraine, because Poland has been a very strong supporter of the Ukraine. It has taken 1.5 billion Ukrainians who are seeking sanctuary. They've also extended a lot of support to Ukraine, both militarily and otherwise. Described Prime Minister Modi's visit to the Ukraine as being a historic one. And I think from that perspective, here is a country that neighbors Ukraine. Here is a country that is possibly one of the closest to the Ukraine. And the Prime Minister of that country has not only welcomed the visit, but he believes that this will be historic, both in terms of its ability to contribute to the restoration of peace and stability, and to bring about what I think are very important confidence-building initiatives in that conflict area.
Is that your opinion as well, Mr. Shringla? Do you personally, as a former Foreign Secretary, believe this is historic? Or would you agree with some of the critics who say it's arguably ill-considered and mistaken?
The way I see it, we live in an uncertain world. As we speak, we have at least 2 regional conflicts that have the potential to expand into larger conflagrations. You have a UN Security Council that is stalemated on both these conflicts, is not able to take any decisions. You have the United States, which is preoccupied with its presidential elections. And you have, of course, the collateral damage that these conflicts have created by way of food and energy security crises throughout the world, with special with more emphasis really on the global south. And I think here, the concerns are not just within the regions that these conflicts are in, but far greater, and it really encompasses the entire world.
So are you
Um,
saying this is historic?
Yes, I'm saying that the visit is not only at the appropriate time, but is also a very, very correct step in the direction to contribute towards peace and security
But
at a
you've
time that we
shied
don't
away
see.
from that word historic, haven't you?
I'm coming to that, but my point is that I don't think at this point of time you are seeing too many initiatives of this nature. When we talk about conflict prevention and conflict resolution, it's very important to have both protagonists engaged. And what Prime Minister Modi seeks to do, I think, is an effort that engages both the protagonists in this conflict, builds confidence, and tries to bring them closer to a negotiating point. That's my sense of what he's trying to do. And it is historic because this is the first prime ministerial visit from India to the Ukraine since the state was formed. This is, in many senses, a first foray that India is sort of initiating outside of its own immediate diplomatic, let's say, areas of engagement.
No,
Going
forgive me,
global.
we did it during the Korean War in the 50s. We played a very active and far more prominent role there than we can lay claim to at the moment as things stand in the Ukraine. You're forgetting that, aren't you?
Yes, but there were, well, as in any other in conflict in the past, there were many protagonists involved, many different countries were involved, as it is today as well. But in recent years, we haven't seen an initiative that involves a global outreach. So I would say,
Let me put an
yes.
alternate view to you, because it's a very prominently expressed alternate view. It's the view that the Prime Minister is only visiting Kyiv because of the sharp criticism from America when he visited Moscow in July and prominently bear-hugged President Putin. That visit coincided, as you know, with a NATO summit in Washington and a Russian attack on a children's hospital in Kyiv, which killed 37. And the criticism is that this visit is therefore a gesture to appease pressure from the West. The Prime Minister is actually making amends for the Moscow visit, which was badly timed and perhaps badly handled.
Prime Minister Modi has been speaking to President Zelenskyy for ever since the conflict began. Even before the conflict, he had met President Zelenskyy in the margins of the G20 in Rome. I was present at that meeting. But subsequently, he has had to engage President Zelenskyy on a number of occasions, including seeking his assistance in getting our citizens and our students out of Ukraine when the conflict broke out in February 2022. Subsequently, he has been speaking to him on occasions of the phone, but has also been meeting him in the margins of important international conferences, including the recent G7 conference. So my point is that he has been in touch with President Zelenskyy. He's been in touch with President Putin. And this is my own view, and this is not an informed view, is that he has had it in mind to visit both these countries, to engage both the leaders, both for our bilateral purposes as well as the purposes of global peace and security. So in my view, it is not under pressure or under duress. He is responding in a certain sense to the global call for an intervention from a world leader, one of the few world leaders today that has the ability to speak to both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. And this is something that the point that I was trying to make when you interjected. Sorry, I just want to finish this point, is that when no other initiatives are taking place, in the beginning of the conflict, you had President Macron, you had Erdogan, you had President of Indonesia go down. But when no other leader is really taking the initiative, I think today is an appropriate time, and Prime Minister Modi is really going at a time when both parties seem receptive to speaking to each other. That's the point I want to make.
To you the very strong reaction from America in particular to Mr. Modi's visit to Moscow in July, just 6 weeks ago. Donald Lu, the Assistant Secretary of State, publicly expressed America's disappointment. The State Department spokesman expressed concerns about India's relationship with Russia. Eric Garcetti, the American ambassador in Delhi, said America should not be taken for granted. PTI, our own PTI, wrote publicly about outrage in the West And the Hindu said there was weeks of bitter criticism which followed Modi's visit. Are you saying to me that none of that has had any impact in determining the decision to go to Kyiv now? Because the truth is, for 10 years, the Prime Minister didn't bother. He didn't bother to go to Kyiv to thank President Zelenskyy for facilitating the return of Indian students. He's chosen to go 6 weeks after that, in quotes, embarrassment, because of the criticism of his visit to Moscow. You're really saying there's no link and connection?
So all the people that you're referring to who made statements obviously did not know about Prime Minister Modi's larger plan. His plan encompassed, in my view, a visit to back-to-back visits. I mean, there's a month and a half in between, but to the extent that scheduling allows, visits to both Russia and the Ukraine. And in a certain sense, if you know I've had the opportunity to work closely with him. I've observed him. He is very consultative. He consults widely, but his decisions are purely his own. I don't see him undertaking this visit in any way on account of anybody else's instigation. I think he has sensed that the time has come, not only for our own country's sake, but for the sake of the entire global South and for global peace and security, that this is the time to make the initiative to speak to both the protagonists in this very, very serious conflict that can have implications on the entire world as we see it. And from that perspective, I think his visit is certainly one that encompasses a comprehensive view. It is not a visit just to Russia or to the Ukraine. And incidentally, the same people today are saying that we are delighted that Prime Minister Modi is making the visit. You saw that Deputy Secretary of State,
words out of my mouth.
Rich Verma.
The words out of my mouth, and that's the contrast I want to put to you. The truth is that whilst Moscow and President Putin are silent, there's not a sound out of Moscow, not a comment out of Moscow about the visit to Ukraine, which starts in about half an hour's time. There's significant praise in contrast from America. Richard Verma, the Deputy Secretary of State, has said he's delighted and he's called it an important visit. Peter Mandelson, a former very senior Labour minister in England, has praised it in the Indian Express. How do you account for this fact? Total silence from Moscow, which you can interpret as not a sign of pleasure and being pleased, and delight from America because Mr. Modi is doing arguably precisely what the Americans wanted him to do.
Yes, so obviously we are getting, a very positive reaction from the West. Russia is not going to comment on your visit to Ukraine, but my own sense is that we would have kept our partners informed. Both Russia, the United States, Europe would have been informed about his visit to the Ukraine. And of course, if you see the think tank community, you are also getting a lot of positive reactions from there. Michael Kugelman, who's quite critical at times, has also said that this will reassert India's position of strategic autonomy and that the West will welcome the visit. So I think, if you look at it comprehensively, not just a visit to the Ukraine, but the visit to Russia as well, you have a scenario in which you have criticism from the West on the first visit, but approbation on the second. You have, obviously, Russia not saying much on the second visit. But the important thing is that when you take it as a whole, you understand that everybody realizes that this is part of a larger plan that is constructed, that is designed in keeping with our own ideas and philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, bringing the world closer together, resolving conflicts through peace and diplomacy.
In a moment's time, Mr. Shringla, because I very much want to talk to you about that larger plan, as you call it. But let me put to you first a second so-called explanation for the visit that begins roughly in half an hour's time. It's one that's been published by the Indian Express. The paper says, and I'm quoting, "India cannot forever view Central Europe through the Russian prism. The visit is about pursuing good relations with both Russia and Ukraine." But the problem, and you know this better than me, is that 6 weeks ago when Modi visited Moscow, Zelenskyy was sharply critical. He called it a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace. In fact, he taunted the leader of the world's largest democracy, for hugging Putin, who he called the world's most bloody criminal. That sentiment could well be foremost in President Zelensky's mind when he meets Mr. Modi today. How should Mr. Modi respond to that? Because that sense of hurt may not have disappeared. It may still be lingering and it needs to be tackled.
I doubt that, because if you see the statements made by the Ukrainian ambassador to India, and he would have made these statements after consulting his capital. He has welcomed the visit. He has said that India, as a representative, as the voice of the global South, is one country that can really contribute to bringing peace about and restoring peace and stability in the Ukraine.
You don't think he was just being diplomatic? After all, he's giving an interview to Raza Laskar of the Hindustan Times. He's hardly going to say anything to the contrary. As you've been a diplomat yourself, you say things that will please the listeners in the country you're
well, that's what we're paid for. But the fact,
and that's what he's paid for too.
But the fact is that whatever he says and does has to have the explicit approval of his superiors and his political leadership, because he is pronouncing himself on a very important issue. So my own sense is that President Zelenskyy has been consulted. Obviously, he is receiving President Putin. He looks at the visit as very, very special. He looks at the opportunity of the visit also to open up a new chapter in India-Ukraine relations, which incidentally has also been quite extensive, but underplayed. In other words, not very well known about. I myself have known about a number of visits from the Ukraine and vice versa on very critical issues such as defense, such as the import of essential commodities from the Ukraine. The ambassador points out that since February 2022, we have had 45 high-level interactions between the Ukraine and India. So it shows that there's been a lot of contact with the Ukraine.
So you're saying to me there is no lingering hurt? That there is no sense in which President Zelenskyy will recall and remember what he called a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace? That's forgotten, perhaps even forgiven?
My bet is that you'll see some very positive and forward-looking statements from President Zelenskyy as the visit takes place. I think there is a great amount of appreciation that Prime Minister Modi has come in person to the Ukraine. He's come to engage the Ukraine on both our bilateral priorities as well as an opportunity to bring the two sides closer together in terms of resolving the conflict through diplomacy and dialogue. So from every point of view, I think the Ukrainians would welcome the visit. Keep in mind that...
Let me raise with you the timing of the visit. It happens after the Ukraine has captured nearly 1,300 square kilometers of Russian territory. And according to the Financial Times newspaper, President Zelenskyy has said that he wants to convert that captured territory into a buffer zone. Now, standing in Kyiv, Mr. Modi can't possibly speak against this, but equally, Moscow would be very upset if he doesn't disagree and demur. How tricky a situation will that be for our Prime Minister?
Well, Karan, first of all, when it comes to conflicts, there's never a good time or a bad time. You know, there's if you have to intervene, if you have to engage the parties, you always have to take your chances, and you can't always choose the right moment. But as far as the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states go, and that's what you're talking about in terms of the Ukraine's own incursions into Russia, into the Kursk area. We have very, very clearly brought out fairly early in our statements in the UN Security Council our respect for the UN Charter and international law, and our respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. If you see our statement with Poland just yesterday, it reiterates those aspects of it. So we are opposed to any attempts.
Forgive me, we made those comments when Russia was in occupation and had invaded Ukraine. It had occupied large parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, and we were still saying that we were in total support of the UN Charter. We were in total support of respecting the sovereignty integrity of states, and yet Russia hadn't done that. So we made those statements even when our actual policy and our decisions on Ukraine are contrary.
So when you make a statement that says that you are opposed to any efforts that could compromise the sovereignty or territorial integrity of states, it cuts both ways. It cuts into Russia's occupation of Ukrainian territory and Ukraine's occupation of Russian territory. As far as impact is concerned, I think it's important for states to voice their sentiments and reiterate their principles. You are not in control of the outcomes. But today, by visiting both Russia and Ukraine, I think Prime Minister Modi has the ability to try and bring these parties closer together, bridge the gaps, as I said, build confidence, and possibly make it easier for them to come to the negotiating table.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Let's then actually explore what you're saying precisely at this moment, that Mr. Modi and India have the opportunity and perhaps the capacity to bring the two sides together. In the message that he tweeted before his departure, the Prime Minister said he wants to share his perspectives on the peaceful resolution of the ongoing Ukraine conflict. My question is a very simple one. Given that India has never criticized Russia's invasion, and is a major purchaser of Russian oil, which keeps the Russian economy afloat, can India really contribute to a peaceful solution? Won't it be seen far too closely aligned with Russia for Zelenskyy to believe that India is an honest, neutral broker?
I can't agree with you that we have not criticized Russia's actions. I think the fact that we have come out in the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly to say that we are opposed to any efforts that compromise the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states is a very clear determination of where we stand, that we do not agree with such actions. Having said that, I think we also make it clear that as far as we are concerned, we don't believe that conflict is a way out in any situation, that this is not an era of war, and that any such conflicts have to be resolved through peaceful dialogue and diplomacy and negotiations.
But
and
would
that
we
is
be
what it is all
welcome
about.
to Zelenskyy as the neutral broker when he sees us so closely aligned with Russia? He has noted not just the bear hug, but the fact that on UN resolutions, we've never voted against Russia.
We will have to ask Zelenskyy that, and I think in the next few hours, we will know his responses. But my bet is that Zelenskyy will be very, very positive on India's actions to come forward to try and work with both sides in resolving this issue. I think real politics, when it comes to states, sentiments that are made at a certain time don't necessarily linger. And at the same time, situations change. The situation has changed quite a lot since, Prime Minister Modi, as you said, made a trip to Russia. Today, Ukraine is in possession of over 1,200 square kilometers of Russian territory. And in a certain sense, I think, has also the basis for some sort of a negotiated settlement, which makes the situation somewhat different. Now, of course, that does not mean that both sides can come to the table straight away or that there would be a ceasefire, because I think every conflict has its moment, and we don't know if that moment has come. But what is important is that President Zelenskyy, and that's the response to your question, I think will welcome any efforts to bridge the gaps and at any efforts that can bring the two sides closer together. At this point of time, there are not too many people making that effort. I don't see Macron doing that. I don't see Erdogan doing that. I don't see the Swiss succeeding in their efforts.
I don't deny that Zelenskyy will welcome efforts to bring the two sides together, but the question is, on what basis and on what terms? You mentioned a moment ago the interview the Ukrainian ambassador had given Raza Lashkar of the Hindustan Times, and there the ambassador has bowled a googly. In the interview, he says that the Zelenskyy peace formula will be one of the most important topics of negotiations. But the problem is that not only has India not endorsed that peace formula, but that peace formula requires Russia withdrawing from Donetsk and Luhansk, but also from Crimea. That's not the Indian position, certainly not withdrawal from Crimea. And yet, if that is what President Zelenskyy wants to discuss and insists upon it, as the Ukrainian ambassador has said, then on that conversation, the two countries, India and Ukraine, are going to differ, not concur.
Well, first and foremost, let me clarify that I don't think Prime Minister Modi's visit is that of a mediator. He's simply offering good offices and all cooperation to restore peace and stability through diplomacy and dialogue. That's his exact words. So mediation is not what we don't believe in mediation because we have our own issues with mediation. Mediation is not what we're offering. What we're trying to do is to create goodwill, try to address any gaps, build confidence. And as I said, if you can bring the two sides towards negotiation, that is very good. But when it comes to what you mentioned itself, about the Ukraine, I think we would certainly, have our own views when it comes to that part of things.
Absolutely. In other words, you're politely saying we will differ with Ukraine. We don't endorse the Zelenskyy peace formula, which the Ukraine ambassador says will be the most important topic of negotiation.
So in diplomacy, every side has a maximalist position. Everybody understands that there are maximalist positions. The Ukrainians have a maximalist position. The Russians have their own positions. Those positions seem to be irreconcilable, but there is always some meeting ground. There is always some basis in which they can come. So the point is that just because you have a position that appears maximalist doesn't mean that it is not a position on which you can at least be receptive to listen to. Okay. So President Zelenskyy will offer his plan. Prime Minister Modi will listen to it. But the fact is that it needs two hands to clap. So without the Russians coming in, you cannot have even the beginning of a negotiation. And that is where the Swiss conference failed, where Zelenskyy had his plan.
I hear what you said, that the Indian side will not seek to mediate. As you said, we have our own concerns and problems with the concept of mediation. Let me then put to you an alternate idea, again, paradoxically and coincidentally, published by the Hindustan Times. The paper said just on the 21st, and I'm quoting, the Indian side is not keen on any direct mediatory role, but has instead indicated that it can pass messages between the two sides. If that's accurate, how do you, as a former foreign secretary, view this role as a go-between or as a courier?
No, I think messages between two sides is putting it simplistically. What is important is that Prime Minister Modi is talking to both President Putin and President Zelenskyy. My sense is that even after his visit to the Ukraine, he will keep in touch with both the presidents. He will see whether there are any broad aspects of their messages that can be, let's say, mutually conveyed. And he will certainly see whether there is any scope that either side is expressing that can bring them closer together. So I think conveying of messages...
very much like mediation suddenly.
No, mediation is when you sit the two sides together and you start negotiating on what could be a compromise. Mediation is a more involved process. What we are doing is creating goodwill that enables us to remain in touch with both sides and creating the broad basis of confidence building that, as I said, would bring them to the negotiating table. And that's when the mediation starts, because that is when you come down to the brass tacks. We are not talking about...
Isn't this what Egypt and Qatar and perhaps even the United States are attempting between Hamas and Israel? They don't have the two on the same negotiating table, but they're carrying messages backwards and forwards and trying to bring some agreement between the two positions. You're suggesting Mr. Modi will try something very similar between Ukraine and Russia.
The difference, I think, is very clear, is that we are talking about a very broad approach towards restoration of peace and stability. Whereas in the Middle East and what you're talking about, it is more a question of getting all the sides together and trying to hammer out a process. I think the Israelis have also been involved in the peace talks in person. It's not just remotely, but certainly mediation can be both remote and in person. I'm not denying that factor. But there is a difference between a broad statesman-like approach to a conflict that seeks to, I would say, build confidence and, in a certain sense, dissipate some of the overlying sort of suspicions that are there.
Tell me
But it is
something.
not mediation. It is certainly not coming. Mediation is going to the brass tacks of that issue. Mediation is saying that how many people would you like in exchange? How many prisoners do you exchange? How much territory do you exchange? That is the sort of detail that is involved in mediation, which we are not getting in.
At this stage,
right now, it is only a goodwill visit that is designed to restore our bilateral relations with two very important partners in Europe, and B, it is also to see whether we can contribute in any way towards creating, as I said, the goodwill necessary that can thaw away some of the hostility and suspicions that are there. And again, I think in-person
Can I interrupt?
In-person approach
has just announced that the Prime Minister has arrived in Kyiv for the Ukraine visit. NDTV at 10:44 in the morning has announced that he is now in Kyiv and will shortly be meeting President Zelenskyy. Let me come back to our conversation. Do you believe that this role, as you're sketching it out, it's short of mediation, but it's a goodwill between the two that we are fostering, would be acceptable to President Putin? Because his silence suggests that it may not be. He hasn't said a word. No one from his government has said a word. His foreign minister is silent. Even his ambassador is silent. Does that suggest that they may have reservations?
If Zelenskyy was critical of your visit to Russia, you can't expect Russia to be, commenting on a visit to Ukraine. But as I said, I think what really matters is the behind-the-scenes discussion that is taking place. Clearly, President Putin would have been informed of the visit to Ukraine, and in a certain sense, we would have been in touch with all of our partners. As I said, the United States, perhaps Europe as well. And it would be a more comprehensive approach. If you saw Prime Minister Modi's statement, he also said we will work with our partners in restoring peace and stability. So there is a sort of a sense that we consult all those that we are involved with, or those who are important in the resolution of this particular conflict, and who are our partners in this endeavor, and that we will take all on board. I mean, there are obviously nuances where you would not expect verbal or articulations of support or in any way comment on that visit from the Russian side. But it's clear that President Putin might have been informed, and he might have also given his sense of let's say understanding of the context in which that visit is taking place. So I would certainly think that the visit is one that has the goodwill of both countries, and that is a given, based on which President. Yeah,
I'll leave it there. This is a visit that you believe could elevate India to a role that we have not played, as you said, for several decades, perhaps not since the 1950s and the Korean crisis of that time. It's a very ambitious role, as you sketch it out, that the Prime Minister wants to fulfill. You believe that, in fact, the Americans would welcome it, so would President Zelenskyy. You think that the silence from Moscow is not necessarily reservation. We have to wait and see how it turns out. I thank you for the time you've made available to me, Mr. Shringla. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Karan. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.